Welcome to the Corporate Director Podcast, where we discuss the experiences and ideas behind what's working in corporate board governance in our digital tech-fueled world. Here, you'll discover new insights from corporate leaders and governance researchers with compelling stories about corporate governance, strategy, board culture, risk management, digital transformation, and more.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Corporate Director Podcast, the voice of modern governance. My name is Dottie Schindlinger, Executive Director of the Diligent Institute, and I'm joined once again by my fantabulous co-host, Megan Day, Strategy Leader here at Diligent. Megan, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Dottie, enjoying the last gasps of summer here in New York. And, you've been busy, Dottie. I have not talked to you in weeks, it seems like.
Yeah, it's been a sprint. I mean, I'll be honest, I spent pretty much most of June and all of July on the road, some for fun, but mostly for Diligent. Just an amazing set of events with directors and with general counsels. It's been great, but it's been a lot. I'm kind of glad to be home, if I'm being honest.
Well, what's the word on the street? What are our customers, what are corporate secretaries, governance professionals, board members talking about these days?
2 words, Megan: artificial intelligence. I mean, that is really pretty much the sum total. It's actually gotten to be kind of a joke because I went to a conference where my topic really didn't have a lot to do with that. But of course, we started talking about, what's changing in corporate governance. 2 seconds in, AI. All roads lead to AI right now, Megan. It's really the topic everyone wants to talk about. It doesn't matter whether you're trying to talk about things like trade policy and tariffs,
I was just going to say tariffs.
You're trying to talk about workforce issues, or you're trying to talk about, what's happening with transaction readiness and the IPO in the capital markets. No, everything is all about AI. So without fail.
That is so funny.
How about you, Megan? What have you been up to? We haven't seen each other in weeks. What have you been up to?
That's so funny you say that because it just, I think, reflects the rapid pace of change that we always talk about, the cliched rapid pace of change and the uncertainty facing folks. I have been spending my time working on Diligent's next virtual summit, which is on the big and bold topic of risk and resilience. I'm in particular leading a session on everyone's former favorite topic, cybersecurity. I feel like that's gone by the wayside now that AI is everywhere, although they are intertwined.
For sure.
I will be talking about cyber risk and AI in the session. But it is going to, I think, shape up to be a great free virtual event for our customers that covers the landscape right now and how, I feel like such a nerd every time I say it, how you turn risk into strategic opportunity.
Well, and that's such a good point, Megan. And I will say, in addition to talking about artificial intelligence at all these conferences, I mean, one of the things that has become super clear really over the last decade, if I'm being honest, is that the job of a board member really has become much more about risk management. And that seems kind of odd. I don't think that really was the job of a board member a decade ago, but it has very much become an exercise in risk oversight and risk management. And to your point, that is not just about avoiding the bad stuff. It's also avoiding the risk of not doing the right things fast enough or soon enough.
Yeah.
And that then led to conversations about AI. But it's true. I mean, I think what directors are really craving always is how can we see around the corner? And the great thing about AI is that while it can't necessarily 100% of the time accurately predict what's around the corner, it's pretty darn good at giving you a sense of the range of things that are around the corner and giving you some probabilities as to which one of those things is likely to be the first thing you encounter. And it's better at that than humans are,
Totally.
Quite frankly. And so that is exciting for directors, right? The thought that in the very, very, very near future, or if you're a Diligent customer in the present, you can have AI-fueled tools that finally help you see around the corner and do it in a credible way with evidence to support it.
Yeah, Dottie, it's really exciting to think about the art of the possible with AI informing scenario planning and analyzing risks that could emerge. And then as a director, how do you just incorporate that into every meeting, into the conversations you're having with management to help them challenge assumptions?
Yeah, agreed. Because I think for a long, long time, we've thought about scenario planning as this like event that you have to plan for. Like you have to plan for planning and you have to kind of gather everybody and it takes hours and you've got to have all this prep done. The truth is we don't need to do any of that. I mean, these AI tools help us do sort of scenario planning on the fly.
Yeah.
So it's okay, you can plug in some assumptions, you can ask for some variables, and then you can quickly spit out, here's the range of things that could happen. And that's in a matter of moments. It's not days, it's not hours. And that I think is really powerful. You know, again, we want to be a little bit careful, right? Because we don't want to advocate using these tools in place of directors' brains.
Yes.
That is not the point. That is not the goal. No, instead, using these tools as a thought partner, right? Using the tools to do the things the tools do well, and then using the director brain for the things the director brain does well, right? So, for example, coming up with a range of examples of things that have happened in the past. That's something AI just crushes, just does great, right? Or predicting, what might be likely based on a set of variables and assigning probabilities to a range of things that might be likely. That's something AI can do great. Deciding what the company should do next, that is something that the director does great. And that's not something that AI does great. Like AI can give you scenarios, probabilities, can kind of spit out examples. You still need your brain to come up with, okay, what are we going to do about this? And quite frankly, that's the really fun part of being the director anyway.
Right.
Having to go do all that legwork and research to figure out when did we talk about this last and what did we do last time and what was the outcome? I mean, that's just so laborious and it's very hard to really answer convincingly. AI can do that in a minute or two. And now you can be freed to say, okay, based on this available information, here's what I'd recommend that we do. And by the way, I've got this friend at this organization that could help us do this thing that I'm suggesting we do. That's how this will, I think, look in the very, very, very near future or even in the present.
Love that, Dottie. And this tees up a conversation you just had with our friends over at KPMG.
Yeah, we wanted to get back with our friends at KPMG because they just did a survey of private company boards. We're always really interested to find out what's happening in the private company space, quite frankly, because it's harder to get data on private companies. They're private. They don't publish all their data. So it's helpful to have, this survey data and sort of find out what is happening. I mean, they were kind of looking at a number of different topics, particularly around strategic planning and scenario planning. And so let's give that conversation a listen and then come back and we'll talk about it some more. Joining us on the Corporate Director Podcast today is Claudia Allen, Senior Advisor at KPMG's Board Leadership Center. Claudia, how are you doing today?
I'm great, and it's a pleasure to be with you.
Well, I'm really excited to have you back on the podcast. I know you're a returning champion. And the reason I really wanted to talk to you is because the Board Leadership Center recently conducted a survey of private company boards. And I know that's going to be published very soon. But I'm hoping that we can spend some time today talking about some of the early insights into the findings and what they mean for private company boards. But before we get into that, why don't you start off by introducing yourself a little bit more than your title and maybe share with our listeners a bit more about what the Board Leadership Center does?
Well, the Board Leadership Center is essentially KPMG's think tank on corporate governance. And by background, I'm a corporate lawyer. I was a partner and co-chaired the corporate governance practice at a national law firm.
Fantastic. Well, you're a good person to talk to then about today's topic, because I know you've just recently conducted this survey that I mentioned of private company boards. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about the topics that were covered in the survey and a little bit about the respondents?
Sure. We periodically do survey private company directors, in part because there's so little information available on the private company space. And this time we focused in on strategic planning and scenario planning and how boards can add value in those areas. And we also asked some questions about AI and technology and investments. And then we heard from about 275 directors. About 40% of them were independent directors. And then directors of family companies, private equity, and founders each represented about 20% of the respondents.
So I know you just mentioned that the survey focused quite a bit on the strategic planning process and on scenario planning. Why was that the focus of this report?
Well, when we last did a survey, it was in 2023, and almost 2/3 of the respondents said that the greatest opportunity for the board to improve its oversight was in the area of strategy. And so given that finding and then the uncertainty and disruption in the current environment, we thought it made sense to dig deeper. And particularly since some of those changes in the macro environment are affecting business models and causing companies to pivot with their strategies. And also because oversight of scenario planning is often identified as a relative weakness by directors of both public companies as well as private companies.
So what did you find were the biggest challenges that were, maybe facing the management team in terms of strategic planning? And did you find anything surprising?
We found that the largest challenges were concentrated in two areas, and each of those was identified by about half of the respondents. And the first was the difficulty in assessing market trends, customer expectations, the competitive landscape. And the second related to scenario planning and the risk analysis process. And I don't think those findings are particularly surprising, given the challenging and volatile environment.
Yeah, I mean, basically, it depends on what time of day you check the news.
Yes.
So doing scenario planning in that kind of environment is really a challenge. Well, let's talk a little bit more about the findings you had on board members. And obviously, this is, the Corporate Director podcast. We have a lot of board members that listen to the show. And I'd love to find out, where did you find private company boards saying that directors can add the most value in the strategic planning process?
I think the areas they identified roughly line up with the areas they identified for improvement by management. And there were three primary areas. The first was challenging strategic assumptions. And that makes sense because part of the role of the board effectively is to constructively challenge management. And in the area of strategy, the goal is to help improve any potential strategy that management presents. And the second was providing fresh perspectives on issues like markets, competitors, customers. And I think this is tied to the idea of the board helping management think more broadly and directors bringing to bear their own experiences professionally as well as their insights. And the third was working with management to identify potential opportunities and risks.
I know one of the other things you spent some time asking the respondents about was scenario planning, and it got a lot of attention in the results that you shared with us. I thought it was really interesting that the majority of respondents said that they are less than satisfied with management's scenario planning process. Why do you think that's the case? Is it because they're just not doing it? Why do you think they said that?
Probably multiple answers. I think one of the issues, again, is the macro landscape. There's so much volatility, and that makes scenario planning even more important than in the past because it really is tied to being agile, having contingency plans, and being able to pivot. And, in that regard, you really can't assume that the future will be like the past. So management working with the board needs to have a disciplined what-if type scenario planning process. And, that process needs to take into account compound risks. In other words, multiple risks coming to bear at the same time, as well as issues like black swan events, those low probability, high impact events like COVID, as well as what some people would call gray rhinos, those slow-moving issues that are front and center that suddenly explode, like war in the Middle East. And I think, secondly, effective scenario planning requires both inside and outside perspectives. And I think that's why when we look at the data, independent directors tended to be more critical than inside directors. And then in terms of the areas that directors believe are most in need of improvement, they cited a few: developing multiple plausible scenarios, assigning probability and determining impact, developing options, in other words, that ability to pivot, and then ensuring that the process is adequately resourced and staffed.
That's a really helpful list. I want to talk for a minute about AI. I mean, obviously, big topic of conversation in boardrooms for the last couple of years. And it continues to really be both a major challenge and source of opportunity for companies. So it's a really important agenda topic. How are the private company boards feeling about how their companies are handling AI at this stage?
Well, I think overall directors are signaling that they believe that they, as well as management, need to do more work. And then if we looked at what the respondents said, about a third of them said they were less than satisfied with the board's understanding of how company was using and plans to use AI, the risks posed by the technology, getting back to your point, and whether the company has the talent to support its use of AI. And less than a third were satisfied that the company has governance processes in place, for effective, ethical, responsible use of AI. In other words, those guardrails that help mitigate and prevent risks. And then, as to technology generally, this really is an area where all directors need to be educated on an ongoing basis. And I say ongoing because the technology is changing so quickly and it's interacting with other technologies. And the idea should be for all directors to be fluent, not experts, but fluent, so that they can understand the risks they have to oversee.
I mean, I can't agree with you more, right? We're big believers in educating the board around key topic areas, especially AI. But I wondered if you could intuit from the results whether boards feel that they're sufficiently equipped and educated already to help their companies navigate AI, or were they saying in the report, we need more? What was your take?
I think most private company boards feel like they could use more. I think we're seeing more people with some background in technology on private company boards as well as public company boards. But to say it's, you have what you need is probably too soon because the technology is changing so much. You just think about what happens when AI interacts with quantum. It's really hard to fathom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's going to be a really interesting thing to keep an eye on for the future. Claudia, any other sort of final observations about this report? Maybe any other stats that really stood out to you that you think are worth sharing with the audience?
I think those are the major ones. I think there's enough there to sort of think through. And I would also say, in addition to surveying the types of private company directors we mentioned, it also includes other company types like not-for-profits.
Oh, interesting. Well, we'll make sure to put a link to the report on our podcast page as soon as it's live and ready for people to download. But before we let you go today, there's a few questions that we like to ask all of our guests on the show. And I know you've played this game before, so I'll be eager to hear if you've got some new answers. But let's start with the first one. What do you think will be the biggest difference between boardrooms today and 10 years from now?
I tend to think that directors will have access to higher quality and more real-time information, as well as likely deeper analysis and insights as a result of technology. So in other words, lessening that asymmetry between the board and management.
You are preaching to the choir here at Diligence. And what's the last thing that you read or watched or listened to that made you think about governance in a new light?
Well, I just read Frederick Bachman's My Friends. It's a novel. And it focuses a lot on the unspoken dynamics among a group of friends. And, it's those unspoken group dynamics in the board context that can really have a very large impact on culture and the effectiveness of a board. Ideally, a board takes the time to examine the culture it has and then whether there are changes it wants to make.
I love that even on your beach read, you're thinking about governance.
Well,
that's fabulous. And Claudia, finally, what is your current passion project?
I'm the reporter for the model corporate statute that a majority of states follow. And I'm working on publication of an update that will also include an explanation of amendments in the last 10 years.
Well, that's exciting. When is that likely to come to fruition?
Hopefully early next year.
Awesome. Well, Claudia, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today and sharing some of the insights from the report.
Well, thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
We've been joined today by Claudia Allen, Senior Advisor at KPMG's Board Leadership Center. Claudia, thank you for joining us on the show.
Thank you.
Good stuff, Dottie. This is hitting home for me. I'm on the board of a nonprofit, and we just went through some scenario planning exercises at our board retreat. And honestly, my takeaway was we're not doing this often enough. That's our job, is to challenge some of these strategic assumptions and bring fresh perspective. And so it was an invaluable use of our time.
Yeah, she brought up in the conversation about scenario planning, and we kind of talked about, the need to be more agile. And the need to be able to pivot more quickly. I just don't think that's ever been more true than right now. I mean, honestly, like we joke all the time, right? Depending on what time of day it is and whether or not our president has had a good sandwich, trade policy might change. So, we have to sort of figure out like, okay, how do we keep on top of things? But she also mentioned you have to still think about black swan events, low probability events that have a big impact, but also the gray rhinos, the ones that are slow moving that can quickly charge you. You see them, they're there, but maybe you haven't spent enough time talking about what we're going to do. And a good example she gave there is war in the Middle East. Like we always know there's going to be war in the Middle East, always. I hate to say it, but it's true. But like what's happening right now with Israel and Gaza, and then how that's expanding into the region, that is something that for a lot of companies deserves some time around the board table, particularly if they are involved in any way, shape, or form in that region or in any regions nearby, any of the adjacent regions. It's something to kind of keep an eye on. So yeah, I thought it was great. And it's also great to, to kind of get that perspective of private companies. I thought it was kind of interesting that private companies, not radically different from public companies in many ways. Yep. And that's reassuring. I mean, you would hope that that's the case. But it is always great to know, right? And it's hard to know because they're private companies. So yeah, really, really interesting. I also thought it was really interesting to hear her cite a novel called My Friends by Frederick Bachman as her governance read. I haven't read that book yet, but I love the idea of a novel kind of giving you this primer to group culture and group dynamics. And she's right, those things matter so much in boardrooms and can totally shape the outcome of the conversation. So I may have to pick up that book and give it a read.
For sure. That reminds me of an article that I was just checking out in Agenda about dealing with a disruptive director.
Oh, yes.
We've all been there.
Oh, yes. Oh, many times. And it's funny. I teach a course on this too, right? And there's kind of my 8 favorite, or I should say my 8 least favorite pet peeve behaviors. And quite frankly, as I always say, we've probably all done them. Oh, yeah. Not only have we observed them, we've probably all done them. And, how can you remediate them? And of course, so much of it falls on the head of the poor board chair or lead independent director, always.
Yes.
And is another great explanation for why you need good leadership in the boardroom, because they have to be able to wrangle the people that aren't exhibiting good leadership in the boardroom, which might be me.
At least you're self-aware enough to recognize that, Dottie.
Am I though, Megan? Am I though? I don't know. Well, that wraps up another episode of the Corporate Director Podcast, the voice of modern governance. I'd like to say a few special thank yous, first and foremost, to our private company expert, Claudia Allen from KPMG, podcast producers, Kira Ciccarelli, Steve Clayton, and Laura Klein. Our sponsors for the show, KPMG, PwC, Wilson Sonsini, and Meridian Compensation Partners. And most especially, thank you to Diligent for sponsoring this show. If you like our show, please be sure to give us a rating on your podcast player of choice. You can also listen to our episodes and see more from the Diligent Institute by going to diligent.com/resources. Thank you so much for listening.
You've been listening to the Corporate Director Podcast. To ensure that you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast player. If you'd like to learn more about corporate governance and tools to help directors do their job better, visit www.diligent.com. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.